All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our online learning webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking about reaching your students offline. Our two presenters are Erin Hamilton and Rebecca Gibney, but one of our tax staff and our curriculum specialists at the IU. We're excited that everybody could make it today. Just a few reminders, you'll be muted till the end for the Q&A just to avoid feedback. And this presentation will also be recorded, so you can access it later. With that in mind, we encourage you to keep your cameras on to help develop community, but if you don't want to be recorded, you can certainly turn it off as well. The presentation will be we'll do a presentation first and then have a time of question and answer at the end. Throughout the presentation, when you're muted, you feel free to put questions in the chat box. Make sure you toggle it to everyone, yeah, we'll answer them as they come up or at the end. At the end of the presentation, I'll put some links in the chat box. One will be a feedback form, which we encourage you to fill out to give us feedback and also to show that you were here today. And I think that's all I have. So I'm going to turn it over to Becky to get us started.
Yeah, good morning. Yeah, it's still morning. Good morning, everyone. Erin and I are really excited to be here with you talking about something that I know Erin and I have been working closely with the state and just even in our region and how we reach our students offline. So I have dropped the presentation link into the chat window. So if you want to click on that, that'll open you up to our presentation. But to get started, Erin and I are just interested, if you could type in the chat, you don't have to introduce your name, but what district are you currently at, or where are you teaching? It'd be really helpful so we can gauge sort of our audience. Good. Awesome. Great, thank you. We do know that a lot of our districts, no matter where you're at, you're going to be experiencing students that are offline. They have no access to the internet. And just so you are aware, there are a lot of ways that we are trying to reach them and thinking outside the box and being innovative. So more coming on that. But today's presentation, what we're trying to have you consider while we're delivering this is, go ahead, Erin. What resources should you consider? We know there's tons of resources out there floating around, but and Scott will probably agree with this as well as he does his studies. A poor practice would be to just give the kid a huge packet and say, here you go, do this, right? You wanted to make sure that if they're offline, they are still doing some meaningful work. And with that comes engagement. So our second thing that we're going to go into today is how do you build that community for your offline learners? And then what does assessment look like, or how could it look for our offline learners? This is very different to what we've ever experienced. So again, we're asking you just keep an open mind, and this is going to be more of a collaborative community here. You're going to be typing some things in the chat where you offer up what you are doing right now and what are some possibilities. So what we'd like you to do is, as of right now, if you've already planned, like started doing instruction or your enrichment and review, how are you providing resources to your offline students now? If you are not, it's okay. You don't have to say anything. But in the chat, if you could type how you're already providing your resources. It might be Packet, which is fine too. And go ahead and type that in there so we can gauge Zoom sessions. Mailed packet. All right. So it seems like the most, if there's no internet access, we're mailing packets home, which again is a solution and a short-term solution, I should say, for now. Very good. All right, Erin, go ahead.
So we wanted to share some resources with you that I'm not sure if you know are available or not, but if you want to go to them now, or we have we linked this in the chat, Becky, this presentation? We can, if not yet, but there are some great resources that the state, the PAIU collaborated together. There was quite a force of us all vetting some resources out. So the work has already been done for you. So instead of reinventing everything, there's some great resources right here. If you go to iu17.org, their website, and I'll walk you through that real quick. If you go to our homepage at the top, under professional learning, there is a tab that says continuity of education resource guide. So if you click on that, it will take you to scroll down. Resources there. Oops, I just clicked the wrong thing. Sorry. Resources that like our online learning hub is there, and some videos, our recorded videos, and our virtual office hours for our TAC team. But along the side here are all different resources that you can use. The ones that we want to look at specifically today are the paper and pencil resources. So if you go to that link and click on the paper pencil resources, the link that I put in the presentation actually will take you right to this paper pencil resources. So as you scroll down, this is a document that was created by our PAIU that has tons of resources to share with you. It goes through subject area, it goes through grade levels, it gives you a small description. The links are all there for you, how to use the resources. Are they free just now during this temporary time, or are they always going to be free to you? Is a good column to take notice to as well. And then the availability across our region, most of them are across PA. So there were just two that I wanted to share with you this morning that I specifically found myself digging through a lot of really great resources. The first one is kind of towards the top here, resource packets by content area, and it's linked with a CSIU link here. So I'm going to take you there real quick and show you. This is a shared drive that is there for all of you to use, and it breaks down by grade level. You can see that we have OT and PT online learning. We have some speech therapy resources. If you just pick a specific grade, for example, I'll pick kindergarten. If I go there, you can see that they have it separated by weeks. So you could go to just the week that we're currently in, or you could also go back if there's something in this week that you don't like, you could look at prior weeks. But there's independent study packets, which if you're working on just giving worksheets to your students, there are some independent study packets here that has been given by education.com. And they're not just worksheets. There's also some really great resources in there for them to kind of get digging through what we consider maybe a passion project, even for the younger kids. The other resource on here that I really liked is to share with you some schedules that they've put together. So this is in that same folder, but it's the second and third grade. So this is an example of a schedule that a teacher is sending home with their students, and it's giving second and third grade learning activities. Now, some of these are offline, some of these are online, so you'll have to go through and decide which ones you want to send to your students, but it's a great way to give them choice. And at the very bottom, it does say, like, these are options. They're not necessarily things you have to do, but they're split up by different courses as well. So I thought that was interesting to share with you guys. The other, so there's your RIU, the paper pencil. And the last thing I wanted to share with you is a choice board. This choice board here is specific to kindergarten. However, I feel like you could make it any grade level that you wish. If it can come out, let's see. Oh, that's not the right link. Let me find it for you real quick. I'm sorry. Here we go. I'll make sure that link is fixed. Sorry about that. So this is an at-home learning menu that they can do. How many ways can you make 10? Write them down. Write a letter to your teacher. Tell about what you're doing during break. Sort coins into pennies, nickels, dimes. Count how many. So these are things that they do not need online for. There's also a movie day menu, which I loved as a parent specifically. So I could have my students pick a movie that they wanted to do. And then there's tons of different activities here that they could do that's offline that would go with the movie that they chose.
Erin, we don't
Yes.
see that for you. Just FYI.
What's that?
We don't see what you're discussing right there.
Oh, how come?
Do you just have it on your website? Oh, like on your...
Hold on a second. Let me see if I can fix this for you.
You can go to, can you go to the next slide for your example?
Yeah, there we go. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
There you go. So hopefully you can see that now. So I'll explain that to you again. So there's all different ones. You could make this like a bingo style for them to make a game. You can just have them have some choice on it. At the top, it gives you some directions, and notice at the bottom it says all activities are optional and provided simply as suggestions, making sure that if our district is in that review and enrichment, that we're giving them that optional, not making sure that they understand that it's not necessary. So those are some of our resources. So going into our community.
Wonderful. Thank you, Erin. So the next thing that we wanted to talk about is, this is great. Like, you can send packets home, things like that. But we also know some of the touch points are really, well, they are one of the most important things is that relationship piece. So even though our students are offline, how do we still build that community? And so a big conversation is, how do we touch, have touch points with parents? Are the parents at home? Are, students, a lot of parents may still be working somehow and the kids have to take care of it. So like, our question for you right now is, how are you, or your districts or buildings, how are you planning to build community? Or how are you thinking about building community with your students that are offline? If you could type that into the chat, that would be great. What are you already doing? And remember, these students are offline. So we're talking about students that have very like little to no internet service. Phone calls, good. Phone calls, texts. Weekly emails, call students. Postcards, that's great. I saw that on Twitter, that was trending. Sending some postcards home in the mail. All right, awesome. So Erin, do you want to skip to the next slide there? So when we talk about building a community of learners and the groups that we've sort of been discussing at the state level, talking about opportunities where we can mentor. So like you guys mentioned, we do have that, pick up a phone, call. Most people nowadays do have phones, not everyone does, but can you make a schedule depending on the class size and make some phone calls every day, 5 a day? Try to make, I know there's like a movement right now, which is like every kid every day, like try to reach every kid every day. That can be a little overwhelming, especially if you have a ton of kids. But when we talk about thinking outside the box, maybe you have a volunteer in your classroom. Maybe you have a custodian or a cafeteria worker, or maybe you're an elective teacher. Can you partner, or a co-teacher? Can you partner with another teacher and divide and conquer? So that every day you have like the daily 5 and check in with these kids. How are you doing? Do you need any help with anything? And not just about school, right? Like you could be asking them about what did you do with your friends, or did you make dinner last night, or just being a mentor and being that role model for them. Just because we're not face to face in school with them, that does not need to stop. So the phone calls, I'm glad a lot of you are doing that. What we discuss is, how do we think outside the box and also pull in people, that we aren't necessarily using at the moment, but still are considered the staff, bus drivers. So thinking in all angles that way. Erin, do you want to add anything with that?
Yeah, I was just thinking of the social part. I think later today and tomorrow we're going to have some webinars talking about making sure you're doing self-care for yourself and touching the social and emotional part of our learners too, because as a parent, I find that in the role that I'm in, I have easy access to a lot of the academic things, but providing my kids with the social part that they're missing is where I'm struggling a little bit. So I think the mentor idea would be really awesome, to have someone that can reach out and touch those kids that are offline also.
Yeah, and Brooke Biter and I, when we worked at Loyalsock, she introduced us to something called the Power 10. So if you look at your lowest 10% of your students and the high risk students, that's that 10% that you really want to reach out to. So if you're on your school heart team or your SAP team, like making some touch points with them and some community partners, big brother, big sisters, things like that. That's a great way to get some of those kids involved, and your community members too. So the mentoring was a big discussion point in how we were going to build community outside of it. I know tomorrow as well, I can't remember off the top of my head, Scott, if it's 9 or 11, but Kelly Sportwood is going to be talking about how you can still build virtual praise and like, how do you still do all those touch points in remote learning? So that's a good webinar to tune into as well.
It's at 9.
9 o'clock. Perfect. Thanks, Scott. All right. So the last thing we're going to sort of touch point with here is, how are you assessing your offline learners? And I use the term assessing very loosely, but how are you providing feedback for your offline learners? If you want to write that into your, and we might not be at that stage yet, but we want you to start thinking about that. If you could take that into the chat, that would be great. Any ideas? Good. Optional enrichment and makeup work. Good. So I do understand that if your district is choosing bucket number, the bucket, they changed the bucket numbers around, but if your district or building is choosing to do the enrichment and review, you are not allowed to assess, which we do understand that. So that's why I use the term assessing very loosely. You're not going to be able to give a student a test and say, here, complete this test. I mean, you can't worry about the whole cheating thing. If that's your biggest worry right now, that's a problem. But, you know, that's not really where we're getting at. What we're talking about is, how do you now assess them in a different with a different mindset? And more importantly, how do you give the feedback? So for example, I like how Todd in the chat here, Todd Moyer, one of our tech consultants, he brought up, you know, can we look at assessing as feedback? And that's exactly what we're trying to get at, because even if you're doing enrichment and review, you still should be giving the feedback to the students. It's not a one-way street. It should be that two-way street. So Erin, if you can move to that next slide. Something we talk about is authentic assessment. So have we thought about project-based learning? And just to get a clearer vision, in about 2 weeks, we're going to be running a week of project-based learning, capstone experiences, portfolios. It's sort of the way that learning and teaching is going to go right now, is how do we move it to project-based learning? And so when you have this is sort of an example here, when I was learning about the difference between projects and project-based learning, which will be in another slide here, how the traditional unit, when we were in the classroom, if you aren't familiar with project-based learning, you know, you have your lecture, you do your activity, your quiz, lecture, activity, quiz, and then you do a final exam or a unit exam, and then the project. That is not project-based learning. That's a unit, and then you have a project, right? But a project-based learning unit, which it might need to will take a different shape. You would launch the project, you give the idea of the project, engage them in that authentic task. You would do your activities, workshops, conferencing, things like that, you know, can do the reflection, things like that, but everything is going into that project. So if you go to the next slide, Erin. Perhaps, yeah. So with project-based learning, you want to start with your standards. What are your standards? What are your goals? What are your learning goals right there in the middle there? What's the key knowledge, the understanding and success skills? Then you want to build the culture around it. So a great example of this is a Genius Hour project, which we'll be talking about in a future webinar. But that's a great example of how project-based learning works. You build the culture around it, you engage your students, you hook them, and then you as the teacher become the facilitator. you're managing activities and you're making some checklists for them. You're scaffolding the student learning. The students are learning through their project. So it's not like you give them all the information, they do a project and show what they learned. They are actually learning the material as they're developing their project. You assess their student learning, which also, that looks as far as feedback. And then you're engaging and you're coaching them. I think coach is a really important word there. And designing and planning, and then you go right back to it. It's also like the engineering and design process. And go ahead, Erin, if you want to click one more time here. And then when you're doing project-based learning and having this mindset, you want to keep in mind that somehow you're sustaining the inquiry. It's a lot of inquiry-based learning. What questions do kids have? It's authentic. There's student voice and choice, reflection. They're critiquing, you're critiquing, they're critiquing themselves, their peers are critiquing them, and then how do they revise it? It then, should become a public product. Even if they're doing it offline, is there a way that they can submit it to you and then you publicize it if they would like that? And, it's a challenging problem or a question. You pose them with a problem. So again, as you're doing offline learning, and a lot of you are on enrichment and review, pose a problem that goes over a skill or a concept you taught before school I don't want to say school let out, but before you were remote learning, and have them figure it out. Use some resources, gather resources, and we'll be doing more on project-based learning, like I said, in 2 weeks, but this is just a way for you to start thinking of it. And Todd mentions here in the chat here for math, there's, Todd, actually, I'm going to have you explain that when we do the question and answer session for us, if you can, so I can read it then too. But Todd brings up some math points too, which I think is great to bring into this conversation. So Erin, do you want to go to that next slide? The very last slide was an eye-opener for me, was, is it a project or is it project-based learning? So projects, it can be done alone. It's about a product, teacher directed. There's not really a real world connection, and so on. I'm not going to read it all to you, but then there's project-based learning where there's collaboration and teacher guidance. It doesn't need to be collaboration with your peer, or like a kid to kid. It could be with you, right? Student directed. It's about the process. And I think that's really important. It's about the process. They're always refining it. So, that's like project-based learning in a nutshell. What Erin and I wanted you to get from that is think about, and I know Todd said it too, think about it not as that you're assessing them, but you're facilitating learning for them, and that it is a process. We see a lot of things out there like, maybe they want to learn how to cook, right? Find a recipe, teach yourself how to cook. That's a project-based learning kind of example. And Erin, do you want to add anything there? Because I feel like I'm just talking, but.
That's okay. Yeah, something that my daughter did recently for project-based learning was sewing. She was watching lots of YouTube videos. She's had a sewing machine since last Christmas that literally has sat in the corner of our house, not touched. So what better time to learn how to use it? So she self-teaching, really watching YouTube videos. It's directed by her, student directed, learning about the process. And she actually put to use and made some masks that she's passed out to her family now, which is pretty cool. And she feels like, authentic assessment right there is that she's proving to herself that she can follow and learn and learn something new. So that's pretty cool. Did you want me to go back to that IU page at some point, Becky?
Why don't we go back to the question, the second slide?
Okay.
Or we can leave it go and not share.
No, that's okay.
I do. So those are the three things that we really wanted you to come away with was, can you go back one more? There we go. When you're thinking about resources, what should you consider? Because again, you are sending packets home, but also keep in mind, how do you build community with these students in that social interaction? And then how do you, not so much assess, but how do you keep that feedback loop going with those kiddos? And how do you provide them with still some offline work that keeps them engaged? So we're going to open it up to some questions and some questions. And Todd, if Scott will unmute you all, but Todd, if you could jump in and mention what you were talking about with math and the higher order thinking, that would be great too.
Yep. Everyone should be able to unmute themselves now.
Yeah, if we look at assessment, remember what Dylan Williams says, you have two kinds of basic assessments, assessment of learning and assessment for learning. So you might not want to use the word assessment, but understand that's what it actually is. Because right now, the word assessment may be a little bit confusing for people. But you definitely can ask questions. How did you get that answer? And this is for any content area. Explain to me your connections. What does this remind you of? All those higher order questions are assessment towards learning, not necessarily of learning. If you think of math, ask them, how did you get your answer? What does this multiplication look like? If I have 3 bears here, how many more do I need to add for 10? All those basic questions. But if you jump them and say, how did you get that answer and what were your thoughts? You've now taken a review example and made it higher order thinking. And that goes from early numeracy, identifying numbers, to algebraic equations.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Todd. Does anyone have any questions, comments, a problem that they want to pose for the group that maybe some other districts are really working on? You can pose it in the chat or voice it out. All right.